Today I'm going to show you how you can add basic authentication to your .NET API. Basic authentication is one of several ways that you can authenticate your API, and basically the way that it works is that every time a request is made to your API, an authorization header needs to be added to the request with a very specific username and password inside of it. And because basic authentication is a standard, it's going to assume that the way that you pass an authorization header is going to be the same every time. And the way that that is set up is that you need to pass the username and the password separated by a colon, and then that string is base64 encoded, and then you append that to the word basic with a space in between. So every request that you make to the API should have an authorization header that has that value inside of it. Now let's go jump into the code and see how we actually do this. And the way that authorization works in .NET APIs is you add an authorized tag to the endpoint or the controller that you want to restrict access to. So you can see here I have an endpoint that I have this authorized tag on because I only want authorized users to be able to see this. Now we need to go and implement how we actually do this. So what I've done is I've created an auth folder, and inside of that I have this Basic Authentication Handler file. And in this file I have a class called Basic Authentication Handler, and it inherits from Authentication Handler. Now Authentication Handler is a class that's provided by .NET, and it's used exactly for this reason, to create authentication handlers. And since our class inherits from Authentication Handler, it needs all of these parameters to be passed into the constructor. So that's why I'm injecting all of these here so that I can pass it into the base class. And then down here we have the handle authenticate async method, and we're going to override that because we're going to implement our own authentication. And inside of this method is where we add all of our logic to make sure that the request being made is an authenticated request from someone that we trust. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that the incoming request has an authorization header. And if it doesn't, I'll just return that it's a failure and they can't proceed. And next, I know that that authorization header does exist, so I'm going to go ahead and grab the value of that here. And then what I'm going to do is check to make sure that the authorization header is not null or empty. If it is, just like before, I'm just going to say that they are unauthorized. Now that we know that the authorization header does have a value, we want to make sure that it starts with the word basic and then a space after it. And we do this because, like I've showed before, this authorization header has to be in a very specific format. And so it has to always start with the word basic and then a space. And if it doesn't, then they're unauthorized. And then the next thing is we want to actually grab the value of the username and password. So we don't care about the word basic, so I'm just going to go ahead and say, give me the token, which is everything after basic. And so this substring is just going to say start from index 6 and then give me everything after that. And then what we need to do is we need to decode the username and password. So the first thing we do is we use the convert utility to decode that string, which gives us a byte array. And then we use encoding to get a string from that byte array. So now this is going to be a string, which is going to be the plain string of the username, and then a colon, and then password. And then what we want to do is we want to split that string on the colon so that we get the username and the password. And since this split command is going to give us an array of strings, what I like to do is just make sure that the length of that array is 2, which means that it has a username and a password. And if it's not, then I just return unauthorized. And then I create a local variable for username and a local variable for password, and I set it to the appropriate item in the array. And then what you want to do is you want to check and make sure that that username and that password are valid. This is just an example. Don't actually do it this way. I am hard coding that the username should be like and the password should be subscribe. But more than likely in your situation, you would probably have a database with a list of users or clients inside of it, and they would have a username and a password. So you would call that database, make sure that they are in there. And if they are not in the database, then again, you want to return that they're unauthenticated. And you may also use a third-party service where you make an API call to them to make sure that that username and password is acceptable. This all just depends on how you want to authenticate your users. And then lastly, assuming that everything is correct, we need to set up the claims, the identity, and the principal, and then pass that on so that .NET knows that this is a valid user. So the first thing I'm doing here is I'm creating a new array of claims. And claims can be thought of basically just a list of attributes for this current user. And a claim is just a type and a value. So the type in this case is name identifier, and the value of that is the username. And one thing to keep in mind is that the type of the claim, it can really just be any string that you want it to be. So if I hover over name identifier here, you can see that it uses a very specific URI that identifies that type of a claim. And there is a whole list of different standard claim types that you can use. But if you want to, you could also just use your own. So you could just call it my username claim if you wanted to. I would suggest using the built-in claim types whenever possible. And the reason is because you can access these later on in your code, and I'll show you how to do that here in just a little bit. And you can add more than one claim. So you can see that this is actually an array of strings. So let's add another one. And this is a common one that you might use, and that would be a role. So if I say new claim, claim types is role. And let's just say in this example that I know that this person is going to be an admin. Again, this would be some type of a lookup that you would do in your database or some service that you use. But I just want to do this for demo purposes. So now we have a claim for the username and we have a claim for their role. And I chose role specifically as an example here because you can also do role-based authorization, which I'll show you here in just a few minutes. The next thing to do is you want to create a new claims identity. You want to pass in your array of claims, and then you give it the claims identity type, which in this case is basic. And then you create a new principal, which you pass in the identity that you just created. And then lastly, you return an authenticate result of a success, and you pass it in the new ticket with that principal you just created, and then the schema name. Now our authentication handler is all set up. We have all of our code in here. Now we need to tell .NET to actually use it. To do that, you go into your program file, and in this section where you see builder.services, you want to add this. So builder.services and then add authentication. And then we want to give it a string for the default scheme. And so this will be basic authentication. And then we say add scheme. And the types for this are authentication scheme options and the name of our handler. I'll come back to this in just a second and explain that a little bit more. And then the arguments for the constructor will be the name. We'll just copy that. And then last, you can pass in some more options. I'm just going to go ahead and pass in null. We don't need them for this. And now you're all set. So in this add scheme, we passed in the options and the handler. I just want to point out exactly what these are for. So these authentication scheme options are the same options that we used in our handler. So you can see here, authentication scheme options is the type of authentication handler that we passed in. And then this is the actual name of the handler that we're going to be using. And that, of course, maps to this name of the class right here. And now .NET knows that anytime we add the authorized tag to a controller or to an endpoint, that it's going to use this authentication scheme. So if I go back into my status controller, here I have authorized. That means that now if I call this endpoint and I don't include this header correctly, it's going to give me a 401. So let's really quick demo that. Here's the Swagger page. If I go to status/auth and say try it out and execute, you can see I'm getting a 401. So now let's make sure that if we pass in the username and password correctly, that it actually works. And Swagger has a built-in way of passing the username and password for basic authentication, but I haven't added that yet. So let's go in and add that really quick. And what you want to do is you want to go into your program file. You want to find this section where you have builder.services.add_swagger_gen, and you want to replace that with this. I'm going to go ahead and import all of my using statements here. And there's quite a bit here, but basically what this does is it adds a button into Swagger so that you can click it, put in your username and password, and then it will automatically append that authorization header to all of your calls. So I'll go ahead and run this and show you what that looks like. Now you can see up here, there's a new little button that says authorize. So if I click that, it's going to pop up a screen where it's going to ask me for the username and my password. So the username is like, password is subscribe, and then click authorize and close that. Now if I come down here to my auth endpoint and I say try it out and execute, you can see now that it says auth is up and it gives the server time. So it's given back a 200. And you can also see right here that Swagger has automatically added that authorization header in there. And you can see it's got the word basic with a space. And then this is the base64 encoded string of my username and my password separated by a colon. And now you have basic authorization set up. And so now what you could do, let's go back into the code. If you go into your controllers, now anywhere that you add this authorized tag is going to require that that authorization header is passed to that endpoint. Now, if you want, you can also add this to the entire controller. And if you put it up here, that means that the whole entire controller requires basic authentication. And now I want to point out how you can do role-based authorization as well. And if you remember, when we set up the handler, we added a claim for the role. And so in this case, I'm just saying that this user is an admin. And so now, if I go into the controller, you can add role authentication to this very easily. So after the word authorize, if you do a parenthesis and then you say roles, now you can add the name of a role that has to be in the claim in order for the user to be able to access this endpoint. So if I say admin, actually just to prove that it will fail first, I'm going to actually make this test and I'll rerun this and I'll prove that it's a 401 and then I'll switch that to admin and then we'll see that it works. So I'll say authorize, close, try it out, execute. Now we're getting a 403, which has to do with authorization instead of authentication. So authorization is whether or not you have the correct roles. So in this case, I don't have the test role, so I cannot see this endpoint. So if I go back really quick and I change this role to admin and I run this again, go back into Swagger, I'll say execute. Now I'm getting back a 200 because I am an admin. Now I want to show you one more thing about claims. So earlier when I was adding the claims, I mentioned that you can see those later on in your code. And the way that that works in .NET is through the HTTP context. And let's say, for example, that I want to modify this response object and I want to include the username of the person that's calling this in the response. So that would be username equals something. And since we added the username as a claim, let's go get that and put it in here. And to access that, you say HTTP context. And this HTTP context object is an object that comes from the base controller, which all .NET controllers inherit from. So if you go up and look at your controller, it's going to be inheriting from controller base. And that's where this context object is coming from. And on that context, we want to get the user. And so you can see that this user is of type claims principal. Well, that claims principal matches up with what we added right here. And then from this user, we can get the claims. And there's actually two different ways of doing it. And to kind of explain it better, I'll go back to the handler again. On the claims principal, we passed in the identity. And so that identity is what actually has the claims inside of it. And so in the controller, you can do this two ways. You can get a specific identity, and in our case, there's only one. So if I wanted to, I could say first or default, and this is going to retrieve that very first claims identity. And then from there, you can get the claims from the identity. Well, the other option is instead of doing that, you can just say claims. And if you look at this, you can see that it says it's going to get a collection that contains all of the claims from all of the claim identities associated with the claims principal. So essentially what this would do is if you have multiple identities on that claims principal, this claims list is going to be all of them. And so just to make this a little bit more simple, I'm just going to use claims here. And then I will say I want to get the first or default claim where the type equals claim types dot name identifier. So I'm going to move this to a new line just so we have a little bit more space. And this is why I recommend using the different claim types from .NET if possible, because this URI identifier won't change. So you know that this name identifier that you used here is going to match up with the same name identifier type that we used right here in our claim in our handler. And now back in the controller, this first or default right here is going to retrieve the whole entire claim. And we just want the value of that, which is the actual username of the user. And so that will now give us a username value. And you can see here that writer is complaining that it's possible that this could be null. So you probably want to do some checks in here to make sure it's not actually null, but I'm just going to be lazy here and do it this way. So now down here for the username, you can pass in the username that you got here. And we should see that in the response. So let's really quick go and test this. Okay, so I have authorized myself. I'll go back down here, execute that. And so now you can see that the username that I passed in was like, and that came back as the value here. So we know that it's working. All right, so that's the basics of basic authentication. And I hope this was helpful for you. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. And if you think there's something I didn't quite do right or should be done a little bit different, let me know. And thanks for watching. I'll catch you later.